I'm Jax. I'm going to be talking about my my master's research project. So I did my master's at the University of Exeter, and it was about portrayals of sharks in the media and how that influenced public perceptions, and then how that influences conservation. I did my master's thesis with Dr. Ruth Thurston. She's an amazing marine historical ecologist. If you ever get a chance to hear her speak or to see her talking, then yeah, do take it. She's great. So I'm going to scoot through this. Who the heck is she? That's me. So I think it's nice to have a bit of an idea of where people have come from, because I think that, you know, I didn't get here by magic, and I haven't been in marine conservation for my whole life, and I didn't always want to be in marine conservation. So that's me. I was playing a caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland when I was 9. I wanted to be an actress until I was about 23, and I graduated from my drama degree. So it was a bit of a weird wilderness for a few years while I worked in finance and hospitality. Then I went abroad and worked on a marine conservation project, was lucky enough to work in several different countries, and eventually came back to the UK to study my master's. That's me in the only lab coat that I've ever worn. Did a field course in Kenya, and then I was really lucky at the end of my master's. There was a job at the Wildlife Trust, which I was very lucky to get. So yeah, I'm Community Engagement Officer on the Yorkshire Beach Rangers project. But I'm here now. It took me a long time to realise that I wanted to be here, and then it took me from then another 13 years since I started in marine conservation to actually get to the position that I am now. So yeah, it's never quite a linear, not always quite a linear progress. So what is so great about sharks? Well, they're pretty cool for lots of reasons, not least because of this picture. So there's over 500 species of sharks all around the world, and this is just a small proportion of them. They're so varied and myriad, and they are in every single ocean around the world. And they have everything from a whale shark, which is the biggest fish in the world, and beautiful with it, and a filter feeder, to this guy down here, which is the dwarf lantern shark, which can be 20 centimeters, and that's the smallest shark in the world. So they're pretty varied. There's a lot of different niches that they fill in every ecosystem that they're in. And yeah, they're pretty spectacular, really. What it also means is they can be a really good indicator of the health of a marine ecosystem. So if there's sharks present and the sharks are doing well, it tends to mean that the rest of the ecosystem is doing well as well, which it might seem counterintuitive because surely they just eat everything. But if there is enough, if there's enough prey to keep sharks going, then that means that the rest of the ecosystem is doing well because the prey further down the food chain is doing well. They also help to keep the populations healthy. So they, from the food that they do eat, they tend to eat the weaker, the iller, the older population. So yeah, they're a really great indicator of an ecosystem's health. They also have cultural significance. So Connor will talk about the cultural significance of basking sharks in the UK. Sharks as a whole, particularly in areas like the South Pacific and Polynesian cultures, they held a huge significance. There's shark gods, which is pretty cool. Yeah, so there's a lot of cultural significance as well as ecological significance, which brings us to the cultural significance in Western cultures, and particularly for people who are around my age or a bit younger, a bit older. So this might be a lot of people's first experience of sharks, first knowledge of sharks, is Jaws. So Jaws, the book of Jaws was released in 1974 and the film in 1975. And it was certainly my first experience of sharks, and it influenced massively how a lot of people in my generation and generations before and after me perceived sharks to be. So it also had a massive impact on shark conservation efforts, whether shark conservation efforts were taken up, if they were funded, and particularly obviously for great whites. So Peter Benchley, who was the author of Jaws, and his wife, as a result of this negative impact, they actually set up a shark conservation organisation, which Wendy still works on. Sorry, the meeting is saying that I've only got 10 minutes left, which I think might be because people joined early. So I'm going to have to see how I go. One moment. what I might do is I might have to set up a new meeting if that does go. Okay, I'll talk really quickly as well. So yeah, Peter and Wendy eventually, Peter for the rest of his life, and Wendy continues to work on shark conservation efforts because of the negative impacts of Jaws. We still have things like Shark Week, which, although it sounds quite positive, is actually still portrays shark as really vicious and as man-eaters, as aggressive. And then there's been, in the last 15, 20 years, myriad different and negative films about sharks, or sharks that portray films that portray sharks as quite vicious creatures. So what role does the media have in that? Obviously, we know that films aren't, they're fictional, so surely that doesn't make any difference. But actually, how they're portrayed in the news media and in the media as a whole really does impact how we see things. And that's not just true of sharks. So, for example, whatever your take on Brexit is and whatever your political leanings are, this was massively influential. And it just goes to show how that one piece that one picture that was shown again and again in the media had a massive influence on public opinion and public perceptions, and it has been shown, as it was meant to have influenced the vote. Likewise, in a positive light, there's something we call the Blue Planet effect, which is, having worked in marine conservation for about 13 years now, I can tell you that there was definitely things were starting to change, and things like the anti-plastics movement was coming out. But around the time Blue Planet came out, there was this wave of support that then came from the public for marine conservation, a passion to try and find out more about the marine life, particularly around the UK for us here. So that's been hugely influential. So those two things show how the media can really influence public perception and actually also change policy. So we've got our Jaws, our shark from Jaws, who's actually the mechanical shark from Jaws, was also called Bruce after Steven Spielberg's accountant, I think it was. And that's one perception of Jaws that we have from the media. And we've also got the new Jaws from Bruce from Finding Nemo, the fish are friends, not food, I think it is, he says. So they could have influenced different generations at different times, but hopefully it's starting to come a bit more positive. So looking at the UK, so how media portray in the UK, a place which isn't well known for our sharks, is quite telling, and I'll go on to how we then talk about how media in countries with lots of sharks talk about it. But this was a report from about 2 or 3 years ago, I think, 5 years ago, sorry, about a boy in Benidorm who was bitten by a shark. So this was the picture that was used on the front page. Jaws attack. It's quite emotive language. And the next picture is of the shark victim of the bite. So if you are squeamish, do look away now. But this is the boy and the shark bite. So it's terrifying, really, that was a newspaper front page in the UK, and it was reporting about this. And if you look at the story, actually, they don't even know if it was a shark, and they think it might have been a barracuda. But that's how sharks are portrayed in the media, and it does influence how we think about sharks. People who've seen that front page are going to be more scared of sharks after seeing it, and that's actually what they're talking about. So when we're talking about the UK media reporting on sharks like that, it might influence how we feel about sharks and shark conservation. But more importantly, in places like South Africa and Australia and the US, where they have the most occurrences of actual shark bites, what happens there is it doesn't just influence shark conservation and whether we protect sharks from bycatch and from habitat loss and all the other threats that we put on them, but it also changes whether or not people decide to support measures to actually actively kill them. So this was the front page of the West Australian just before the shark call vote. And it was obviously photoshopped, a picture of 2 kids enjoying the water and with a shark fin in behind them. And that was an actual front page of an actual newspaper. So that's not even trying to hide the fact that they're trying to influence the vote. So in that point, it can get quite scary. You're not just influencing conservation, you're influencing whether sharks are actively killed and in the process, usually other marine organisms as well. So, so my research was looking at at the perceptions of shark or portrayals of shark in the media, but with a marine historical ecology perspective. So marine historical ecology is a really interesting area of research, and it's relatively new. So what marine historical ecology and historical ecology as a whole tries to do is to fill in data gaps, but also to extend existing data sets further back than scientific records. So traditional scientific data sets go back about 50 years, sometimes 100 years, depending on what you're looking at, but not generally much further than that. So it's quite a limited time period. So what marine historical ecologists can do is they use novel sources of data, so such as this photograph or paintings, even menus, logbooks, and newspaper reports. They can use that as a source of data, so to fill in those data gaps, and it can also then inform a fuller picture of what the actual natural state of that ecosystem is. So it helps you give you a better baseline. So in ecology, there's something called the shifting baseline syndrome. So there was a study where they spoke to 3 different generations of fishermen in the same family in Mexico, and they asked each of them what they thought the natural state of that marine ecosystem was. And the grandfather and the grandson had very different perspectives of what was natural in that system. So the grandfather had more fish, more species, bigger fish, and lots of different kinds of things. So that's just a simple example of the shifting baseline syndrome, that the perception of what is natural changes through time. So marine historical ecology tries to inform that by using these novel data sources. So this is a picture that my supervisor, Ruth, used in some of her data collecting for a paper that she wrote in 2016. So from this photo and others like it, they would have looked at what species of fish were in this photograph, how big those fish were, how abundant they were, and then compared them with other photos, with other data sources, to try and build up a longer term picture of what that ecosystem had been like over a longer period of time. So it's a really interesting area of research, and I really enjoyed looking at it. I'm just checking, mindful of the time. Okay, we've got 6 minutes. So my particular study was only a 3-month study, so it wasn't very long. So I looked specifically at newspaper reports, and that's because we had newspapers are the longest sort of media that we have records of. And we also had an amazing resource called Trove in Australia. They have digitalised all of their newspaper archives, so you can get them online. So we looked at Queensland, Australia, partly because we had that as a data source, and also Australia is one of the hotspots for shark bites. We looked at unprovoked fatal bites because we were looking at bites that weren't sort of provoked by a shark being harassed or by being fished, and only fatal bites because it means that it was more likely to actually be reported in the news. And we only looked at 3 20-year time periods. So initially we'd looked from 1850, when we had the first newspaper archive, up to present day pretty much. But because of the limitation of our time, so I collected news articles for that whole time period, and I had about 800 news articles to analyse. So because of the limited scope of the research project, we actually split it down to 3 time periods. So we looked at from the first 20 years of the 20th century, there had been an in-water daylight swimming ban in Australia until 1901, and that was actually an indecency law. It wasn't anything to do with sharks or safety. It was about people being out in their underwear. So that was lifted in the 1900s, so people were more likely to be in the water. We also looked around the mid-50s to the mid-70s, so when surfing was becoming more popular, up to when Jaws was released. And then we looked at the most recent period that we had data for. So in that data collection, we used Trove, which was this amazing resource where you can get digital versions of the newspapers. And for each of those articles that we had, we broke it down, and I created an analysis matrix so we could look at both the visual impact and the content of each article, and the actual content of the article, and how emotive the language was. So for visual impact, we looked at things like the size of the headline compared to the rest of the text on the page, where it was in the newspaper. So if it's front page, it was quite a high score. For later articles, we included whether photographs were included or not, and just how much of the page that the article took up. So this was quite a high scoring article. This would have been about somewhere between 5 and 6. Compared to this one, which is a very small headline, very small paragraph, basically. Nothing else to try and draw the eye, no borders to it. And it was quite small on the page, so this was just a small cutting from the page. So that one was less than a 1, and that one was more than a 6. So for each time period, we analysed all of the articles relating to each of the shark bites, and took collated all of those scores together, so we had an average score for each of the time periods. And so this is a box graph of those results. So just in case you're not familiar with box graphs, don't panic. Neither was I. So this line isn't really what we're talking about. So the 4.76 is this line. The box is just where a majority of the results are, and this vertical line is just then the range of other results. So the highest score we had was a 6, and the lowest score was somewhere about 3.5. But this is what we're looking at. So we've got 2 minutes. This is good alarms time. So I'm just going to set it for actual 8 o'clock. Actually, does everybody have to go and open a window? No. Okay. Right, we'll give it another minute, and then I'll let you go to your window, and then we'll come back at a minute past. Okay. So these are the 3 time periods. So the first time period, the second, and the third. So as you can see, there's quite a big jump between the visual impact of articles in the first time period and then the second and the third. There's also quite a difference in between articles in the time period, the last time period, sorry. So the first time period, they're all quite similar. There's a bit more of a range of impact in the last time period. But actually, the visual impact between the second and the third went down a little bit, so it was a little bit less impactful, which is quite interesting. I think we'll pause there for a moment, and then we'll come back at 1 minute past 8, so everybody can go and do your cheering. If you've got to go and do singing as well, then please do crack on. But yeah, we'll go and open windows and do some cheering. This has been a really smooth presentation. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Okay. So, right. So as well as, straight back into it, professional, so professional. So as well as analysing the visual impact of the articles in each of those 3 time periods, we also analysed the content, or I also analysed the content. And I was looking at the language that was being used in those articles to talk about sharks. But we also looked at it in 3 different categories. So we looked at sharks, language to do with sharks, language to do with the bite victim, and then language of the incident overall. So how emotive were they about the incident overall? With each of those categories, we looked at another section of it as well. So with sharks, we also looked at whether they were implying that the sharks had a sense of agency. So if they implied with words like hunting or mauling, or implied that there was basically the sharks, had a sense of agency and control over it, rather than sharks just trying things out with their mouth, that gave them a higher score as well. And with the bite victim, we looked at how much detail they went into. So did they talk about where they were from, what job they did, if they had family, and the more detail they went into, again, the higher score. So that's just an example of one of the matrices we used for sharks. So there was 0 score for no mention of anything beyond a shark, 1 for if they only talked about factual, down to if they were using a high degree of strongly emotive language. So monster and man-eater, man-killer, deadly menace. So some of the examples are genuine examples. Crazed by the scent of blood. So you can see how we basically analysed the language. So this is the results. So putting all of the results for sharks and victims and the incident together, this is how those results look. So again, quite a clear increase between those 3 time periods in the scores. What was quite interesting was when we split them down. So there's an increase for sharks, there's an increase in the emotiveness for bite victim, and there's an increase for incident. But what we found quite interesting was that, particularly in that between those last 2 periods, the emotiveness of language about sharks only increased very slightly. And we didn't include it in the analysis, but Ruth has had students who've carried on with the research since, and they looked at the scientific language that was used or references to conservation. So I found in the later articles that there was more likely to be a scientist interviewed. They had more references to scientific information, and they also talked more about the need for conserving sharks and their threatened status. So that was something that was really interesting that we didn't actually include in the analysis because of the lack of time. So an overview of the results of my research was scores did tend to increase over time for both visual impact, and the emotiveness of the content. Shark-related content changed the least during that time. But as always, more research is needed, and there's always more room for research. So what are the gaps and the shortfalls, and what else would we look at? So we'd like to look at comparing reporting. So is it just a change in reporting styles over time? Is it not actually anything to do with sharks and perceptions of sharks? Is it because reporting has become more sensationalist? So Ruth was looking into potentially comparing attacks, shark bites with attacks of other animals, and say dingoes in Australia. We also talked about maybe looking at house fires and fatal house fires, and if that changed over time. We also would like to have expanded the time periods that we're looking at, so looking at that whole time period that we had newspaper articles for, also looking at wider areas, so not just Queensland, but the rest of Australia and potentially even further afield. I'd like to look in more detail at the victim's profile. We did an initial analysis on the victim's relationship with the water, like whether they were a regular water user, if they worked on the water, or if they were just a holidaymaker. But there wasn't any conclusive results from that, just because of the number of the sample size, basically. But it was quite interesting looking at things like race and gender, age, and social status and job. They all had an influence, I think, from looking through. There were articles earlier on, particularly where if there's an Aboriginal victim, that there wasn't any articles about that shark bite. So that would be something interesting to look at in more detail over a broader time range. And then, as I mentioned before, scientific content, looking at what kind of scientific content and references to conservation efforts. So what does that mean? And what can you do in your sort of daily life? So there are a couple of projects and there are a couple of organisations that really look at how people talk about sharks and how that influences what we do and how we think about sharks. So Bite Back Shark and Marine Conservation, I'm not sure if they're still going actually, but they were, a couple of years ago, they had a project called Mind Your Language, where they were calling out news agencies if they were using overly sensationalist and emotive language about sharks. And the Shark Trust are really good at working on that as well, and making sure that they hold people to account and report about sharks realistically. A lot of my preparation for my research project and my literature review that I did, I looked at a lot of the work of Dr. Christopher Neff, who looks at a lot, his research was looking at public perceptions of sharks, particularly to do with shark bites, and how that influences policy and legislation. He did a really interesting paper on the language that we use in relation to shark bites. So I tried to be really careful about saying shark bites, because there are newspaper reports that I read around the ones that I was looking at, where they would talk about a shark attack, and actually there wasn't even any interaction with the shark. It was literally just somebody seeing a shark. So Christopher Neff proposed a new language of describing shark encounters, basically. So you go from a sighting where somebody sees a shark but there's no actual interaction, to an encounter where there may be some kind of contact but no biting, or maybe a close call, to a bite where somebody's bitten but they survive, to a fatal shark bite. That might seem like quite a small thing, but the language that we use really influences how we think about things. There's been quite a lot to talk about it recently. I think in Ireland it is, that instead of calling this a lockdown, they call it cocooning, which is a much nicer way of thinking about it. But also talking about social distancing and physical distancing. Actually, what we're trying to do is physically distance at the moment. So now's quite an interesting time to be talking about the language that they use, and also about the influences of the media. So yeah, so these little things, they're things that you can do, and when you hear other people talking, you can bring that into the conversation as well, and it can maybe help sharks out a little bit. So thank you very much for listening. That is my presentation. Thank you very much for bearing with me. Oh, and this is, I've got time now because I've had 2 presentations. So this is an illustration of Dakuwanga, which is the Fijian shark god, and he is fighting the octopus goddess. So, sorry, just a really cool picture. Just wanted to share. So I'm going to see if there's any questions. I don't have the questions from the other one. If you've got a question and I can see you, you can put your hand up. I just thought somebody put their hand up, it's me. But if you've got a question you want to ask, you can put your hand up or write it in the chat. Hayley Dalton's got a question. Thank you, Hayley. So Hayley asks, if public awareness of the marine world and marine conservation is on the rise, are you surprised by the overall increase from your content analysis? Not really, because just of the time periods that we were looking at, it was before, I would say, it was definitely before Blue Planet and before that sort of wave changed. But also, I think still in the media, there is still a lot of negativity about sharks, and it is changing. I think there's a lot more awareness these days of the role of sharks in healthy marine ecosystems. But no, I'm not massively surprised. I think we're probably, you guys, you've come here because you're interested in sharks, so we probably have a very different perception than the general public as a whole. It's changing slowly. I'm sure Colin would have more of a perspective on it, but no, not massively surprised. Is there any other questions?
Just to say, well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And beautifully inserted NHS clapping time. Very impressed.
I realised I didn't mute myself, so you're going to hear me struggling to open the window first of all, and then just hollering out the window. Yes. Oh, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I've done a lot of free diving with sharks, including great whites, with no cage. I've got a lot of sort of footage and info from around the world, and I sort of test out different patterns and safe anti-shark sort of deterrents. So I don't know if at any time anyone wants to rack my brains on it or anything like that. I've also got some beautiful great white teeth and megalodon teeth and stuff like that. So yeah, if you want another meeting, maybe.
So I did this talk almost exactly a year ago in the Driftwood in St Agnes. Did you come to that? Is that where I've met you?
Hello, it's me. Yes.
Hello. I was like, I know your face.
How's it going? Yeah, so if anyone wants to rack my brain at any point, then I'd be more than happy to sort of have a chat as well. So
that'd be really cool.
I feel like I'm a bit out of tilt and how to get hold of you. Like,
well, I'll put my email address here, and then if you contact me, it might be really good because we've got things happening all month. Maybe we can get you to do a bit of talking as well.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I have to learn how to use the app, but yeah, I've got some really interesting footage and stuff. So
awesome. And
experiences.
Our social media apprentice, past and present, are here.
Oh,
so they're always looking. Well, Jodie's always looking for content now.
Brilliant.
Fact, previous one, Adele, the previous one. Adele asked, what's my favourite shark? I don't know. Don't make me choose. Um, I've recently I've been saying a wobbegong, but I think that's just because I really like saying a wobbegong. Like, it's a good name. So yeah, I do like a tasseled wobbegong, and I had a dive in Australia with some wobbegongs, and yeah, they were really cool. But I don't know. They're all so cool. They're all so weird. I did a really cool dive with bull sharks, where the bull sharks were fine and they were super chill, but the shark suckers attacked. I had dreads at the time, and the shark, the remoras kept biting my dreads. Terrifying. The lovely Lou and Colin, hello. We were wondering whether there was much difference in perception detected between countries. I don't know, and that's something that we'd really like to look at, and something that Ruth is trying to. So she tried to collect more data when she went back. She used to work at the University of Queensland, and she's now at Exeter, obviously. She tried to get more data from different places in Australia, and she's also been talking to people in South Africa about getting potential newspaper articles from there. So yeah, I don't know, but I mean, it would be really interesting to look at. I think especially between countries where there's lots of sharks, I think it'd be good to look at the different, because culturally, I think as well, like in the South Pacific, they're much more revered and accepted because it's just, we're in their realm basically. I know in Fiji, there's a lot more acceptance of if people got bitten by a shark, it's because you're in the sea. So yeah. If there's no other questions, then we shall call it a day. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you're all safe and well and in these weird old times. But thank you for bearing with me with the technical issues. And yeah, look out for the rest of the shark bump activities. Thank you, Lord. I didn't know you could do hand claps on this, guys. Well done. So yeah, look out for more stuff from us at the Yorkshire Beach Rangers, and also for more talks from Seaquest Southwest. Thank you very much indeed.